Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's virtual leader chat. My name is Matt Kanter, and my very long job title is Executive Director, Associate General Counsel, Litigation. I'm very excited to host today's virtual leader chat. As you know, tomorrow is Canada's first National Truth and Reconciliation Day. And in advance of this day of reflection, I'm really looking forward to our discussion today with guest Lorelei Higgins, who is Mrs. Canada Globe 2021. We'll have to ask her about what that is. She's also a Métis Canadian Cultural Mediator, a Rotary Peace Fellow, and community lead for the City of Calgary's anti-racism program team. I'd like to invite our guest, Lorelei Higgins, as well as Brian Gay, Manager of Valuation and Customer Relations from the Peterborough office, and member of MPAC's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Champion team to the VLC. Welcome, Lorelei and Brian.
Hi, Matt. Hi, Lorelei.
Hi there. So, Brian, I'm going to start with you. You recommended Lorelei to our VLC team about a year ago to be a guest. What made you recommend her to our team?
Yeah, I think at that time, I began really working with Royal Roads University as a junior researcher in the field of equity, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. And we had our leadership conference, and I heard her speak. So not only from a professional or academic perspective did it resonate with me, particularly the peace building viewpoint and the global perspective, as she is also a member of Mediators Beyond Borders International. But also it kind of resonated with me at that particular time personally, as I was going through my own struggles in being accepted as a mixed race individuals, but viewed as something as something different. My kids were also going through a similar struggle, and I can remember hearing from my dad and some of the older relatives about that similar struggle. And I became really inspired by her messaging. That for me, as someone who identifies as mixed race, that one, it is okay, and two, I am not half of anything, but I'm doubled, which means I can offer more in building awareness, compassion, and understanding. At the same time, we were going through our own journey as the MPAC community, starting off, the Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Anti-Racism Committee, with a lot of passion. And I just thought, we need to hear from her. We need to have her as part of our journey and to share the words across borders, i.e. provincial borders, right? And here we are today, at the right time, at the right moment, before a very significant day tomorrow. So thank you, Merci, Lorelei, for sharing your time, your words of encouragement, and your support. Thank you.
That's terrific, Brian. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing and for making the recommendation. And Lorelei and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, and so I can assure you that this is going to be really interesting. She is going to talk, I'm sure, about being mixed race and what that means, and we're going to talk about that. And it's great to finally have her on the virtual leader chat, and particularly in advance of the significant day tomorrow. So thank you, Brian. So, Lorelei, we're going to talk a little bit about National Truth and Reconciliation Day shortly. But for those of us who don't know you and don't know your work, you went on your own journey of self-discovery that led you to uncover your Métis heritage. Can you tell us a bit about your journey and how you uncovered your heritage?
Absolutely. So Tanche Bunmetan, Lorelei Shinakashun. Hi everybody. It's so lovely to be here. And I want to compliment Brian on his Michif. So that's Michif that I just spoke. So in your personal space, I can't see any of you out there, but if you want to give me a big Tanche in your own space there, I can probably feel the vibes coming. Michif is one of the disappearing languages, and it's so exciting that for the Year of Languages, the United Nations has identified Michif as one of the languages. So Brian's already ahead of the curve practicing it. So But yes, it is so lovely to be here. Normally I'd be calling in from Treaty 7 territory over in Calgary, Alberta. Today I'm actually in Kamloops. So Kamloops, for those of you who don't know where that is, and I will be part of the National Day tomorrow here at the residential school. So Matt, you asked about my own cultural journey. It has been a journey, and it's so amazing for me to be here 22 years later, speaking about it in a way I never imagined. So 22 years ago, I was definitely a young woman who didn't know a lot about my cultural roots, was scared to ask, and also felt a strong sense of shame. And so when I was about 18, I decided that I didn't want to live like that anymore. I didn't want to not be able to speak about where I came from, not be able to ask about my biological father. And I wanted to know why my records were actually so messed up, why I couldn't find parts of my family. And so I began the journey. And it just began with a sense of knowing that I belonged somewhere in an Indigenous community. There was nothing more than that. I just looked in the mirror. I didn't look like my parents who raised me. I didn't feel like I quite fit into my small, predominantly white town. And I certainly didn't feel like I fit on the reserves either that surrounded me. I felt like I was definitely in the middle ground. And so I just started asking questions, and things appeared that guided me along the way. And 22 years later, I'm so happy to say that I can proudly speak my language and wear my Métis sash. And I have my records straightened out, which included a court case. And here we are today.
No, that's great. And do you want to talk a little bit about your journey? I know you talked in our pre-call about your journey sort of to Bolivia and your work through with the Canadian government.
Yeah, so life throws you funny things. So there I was thinking, you know, I need to know more about my culture and identity. And I did a degree in political science and wondered, you know, what job will I do now? And I was very lucky to get an internship with the Department of International Trade and Foreign Affairs at the time. So DFAIT is what it was called at the time. And funny enough, the program they put me in and assigned me to, the project, was a cultural rediscovery program. And so there I was already on my own cultural rediscovery program, and then literally helping implement programming with Indigenous communities globally. And so there became this strong sense of, you know, I was asking youth who predominantly were Indigenous coming to live in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, to rediscover their cultural roots and be proud of where they came from. And there I was going, well, I have a lot of work to do myself. And the elders that I worked with in Canada who trained me, they said to me, you know, you do have your own work to do, but part of it is in order to learn, you have to teach. And so there I was asking hard questions of youth, but then asking them of myself and really digging into what culture means. And so I was given this sash by an elder in Canada, Christine Joseph, and she said to me, Lorelei, what I can tell you is you're Métis, but you have a lot of work to do. And so that has carried me throughout all the years. And in terms of the project in Bolivia, it's still running. The youth who ran the projects, their younger brothers and sisters are now running the project. And I have to say, there's a lot more youth living in Santa Cruz who are actually Indigenous and identifying as such with a sense of pride.
It's such an interesting story of sort of how you sort of went on your own cultural rediscovery program inadvertently, and then led to your own personal cultural rediscovery. One of the things you just mentioned was, you know, it was asked, what does it mean to you to be Métis? Can you sort of just explain what it means to you to be Métis in Canada?
And that's been a journey in itself. And as you're starting to see things in the world shift, the Métis Nation themselves too is also able to show up in a way that I think in the past hasn't. So the Métis people weren't even recognized as a group of Indigenous people in Canada until our 1982 Constitution. And so there's also a lot of legal framework surrounding our own identity. There's a lovely exhibit called Hiding in Plain Sight, and it really talks about how the Métis have always been here. Our cart tracks are actually across Canada, a lot in Western Canada in particular, but literally we were the go-betweens. And for those of you who don't know, some of the names that we've been called in the past are the children of the fur trade, half-breeds, that's always a popular one. And really like sort of, I've heard road allowance people, the ditch people, because we were the people that were always like kind of there, but then like not fully Indigenous and then not fully part of the fur trade community. And so we created this whole fabric in between. And I love the exhibit Hiding in Plain Sight because we've always been here. And some of the treaty negotiations were actually led by Métis people. And so Jerry Potts is one of the most significant ones. And so being Métis actually it's that lovely middle ground. And I used to always think of myself as in between. So I'd always be like, well, I'm half this and I'm half that. And Brian alluded to it, that idea of like, well, I'll be a bridge and I'll be like, stretch myself so thin that I'll be both. But I read this wonderful quote a few years ago, and Brian also alluded to it, but it's by Terry Saint Amand. And he actually talks about being Métis is being blessed with not one family tree, but two. And so I really started to reframe that idea as a leader too, of like, I'm actually not in between, I'm both. And so I have the benefits of being super skilled in sort of the European ways of thinking. And I have the benefit of also having Indigenous ways of knowing. And so that gets to show up and I get to be all of that. I don't have to be half of either one.
No, that's great. So I know you talked about that metaphor a lot. Sort of how does that translate into your sort of life and your work?
Yeah, it's funny how your DNA can sort of guide you without, you even realizing it. So I naturally have been a mediator my entire life. I always thought it was because I was a middle child. We all know how that goes. You're always making peace. But at the end of the day, culturally, I'm that as well. And when I read more about my family's history and the post that we held with the Hudson Bay Company, we were the middle ground. And so it's so amazing because my forefathers came from England and they came over to the Red River in Winnipeg. And so when you go to Fort Garry, our surname is Parker on the English side, and it's filled with Parker suitcases and Parker everything. And there's this really strong history. But once my grandfather came over, it's pretty amazing because then he met my grandmother and they together created a brand new sort of coming together. And my basically, we got to experience what it was like to create a new nation and to be both. And so having that in our history is amazing because you start to see when you read more about Métis people and the roles that they've played since the 1800s, you can start to see, I would equate it to like, if you think of a web, the Métis people really being that go-between between this large fur trade occurring from Europe and this encounter with Indigenous peoples and figuring out how do we trade across Canada and how do we learn to speak across languages.
It's fascinating, the sort of the Métis history and how you discovered your Métis history. I want to move on to a couple of other sort of topics. One is the sort of the most interesting thing in your resume is that you're Mrs. Canada Globe 2021. So first of all, I assume you have your crown somewhere.
I'm really happy you asked, Matt. I just, I happen to have it on hand. So this is the crown. For those of you who are curious, it's Swarovski crystals and it's quite heavy. and just because you asked, Matt, I also happen to have the official banner.
There you go. So for people who don't know, what is the Mrs. Globe competition and how did you get involved in that?
Yeah, so it's a pageant, but at the end of the day, it's really interesting. Indigenous peoples have a long history of pageantry, internally and also externally. And so many people may know former Mrs. Universe is Ashley Collingbull, who comes from Enoch, Cree Nation. She's quite famous now. But in any case, for me, the draw was many things. I had competed 20 years ago for titles so that I could get a scholarship for university. That was a different pageant system, but I had competed and had just needed a place in the top 10. So I have a little bit of a history. But that being said, 20 years later, when I was approached to compete, it was a lovely coming together of everything. And at the first moment, I sort of hesitated of like, would I compete again? What would that look like? But the person who approached me, I was really talking about the things I was doing in the world. And so one of the roles I have is an ambassador for the Institute for Economics and Peace. And when speaking with them, there was a bit of a joke of like, hey, what if you went to the pageant and actually talked about world peace. And the Institute is, and I was like, oh, like Miss Congeniality. Like, and I love the end of that movie when she said, I really want world peace, because that is literally my job. And so the Institute said, you know, we have the 8 pillars of positive peace. And what if you had the opportunity to actually talk about what those 8 pillars were and what it takes to create global peace and strong communities? And I really liked that. I was like, I think that's interesting. And also COVID afforded me some extra time, and I was dressing up every day for literally nobody. So then I suddenly was like, okay, I have something to dress up for, and then I'll also have a crown, which would be lovely. And so it all started coming together. But I went to my elders and I said, what would it look like for me to compete in a good way and also to carry my culture in an authentic way? And the elders were amazing. They said, Lorelei, this is an opportunity that you can't pass up. You can carry your culture by using our language wherever you can, appearing wherever you can in the Métis Sash. And they said, and really authentically talking about issues that are pertinent today for Indigenous matters. And, you know, we could go through all of them. And this week is a really important week, is one of them. And so it all came together as I couldn't say no after that. And so I had 6 weeks to get ready because it had already been delayed because of COVID. And so within 6 weeks, I decided to do it. I got all the gowns ready. I prepped myself. I watched a few videos. I trained as hard as I could, and off I went to Vegas and competed. So, and the result is I won. And because of COVID, it normally runs June to June, but because of COVID, I was crowned in November, which was quite late. And this June, we actually didn't crown a new Mrs. Canada. I have the opportunity to stay on until next June. So I'm literally the COVID queen forever until we can crown a new Mrs. Canada.
You talked about putting, you know, getting all of your gowns out of storage. I found a collar today and put that on for you. That's the best I could do.
You look very fancy today, Matt.
much fancier than the last time we spoke, I know. So you talked a little bit about how you gained the support from your elders to enter the competition, which is great. So now that you have won and you are Mrs. Canada Globe, how are you using this platform to raise awareness of matters that are important to both you and your community?
Yeah, and so I'm really lucky because I can blend both worlds, and that's where that mediation space and like I don't have to pick becomes everything. And so it's a lovely place to be because everywhere I go, I would probably be doing some of the same things, but I get to bring the crown with me. And so then it widens the platform and the network. And I've had the opportunity to also bring some of the pageant women into some of the sessions and actually have them facilitate and have a bunch of beauty queens talk about world peace. So we have a lot of fun with it. And I have to say, you know, I have some natural hashtags like Peace Queen and things that have emerged. But that being said, what I really love is this authenticity where I can actually walk in a space that does make sense. And because of Canada's colonial history and my own British roots, it is ironic that I carry a Métis sash and a crown because those are both parts of who I am. And that is part of Canada's history as well. And so I do feel like there's an embodiment that has happened. And so some of the exciting things that I've got to do that maybe would have occurred naturally, but this is like that extra people like, and you're Mrs. Canada, and people are excited about it. Like I've never felt so loved and supported by Canadians. And it's such a pleasure to represent our nation in this way. But people ask me, you know, like they think I'm interesting to begin with, and then they say, and you're Mrs. Canada? And so the number one thing is, can you bring your crown? Can I touch it? How long do you keep it for? And people are always like, so you're Mrs. Canada now, like right now. And so it's always fun to tell people like, yeah, like right now, that's me. But that being said, I've got to talk to the United Nations Commission on the Status for Women. I've been working in Tennessee with the World Affairs Council. And anything I can sort of get involved in, I've been putting my hand in. My newest thing that I'm working on is Indigenous peoples in Canada are seeking an audience with the Pope. And so there's been a time scheduled to actually talk about residential schools and a formal apology from the Vatican. And so I've been actually working on the Métis delegation to see if there's a spot for Mrs. Canada. But I feel like it's a lucky place to be because as Mrs. Canada, being an apolitical role, I can actually do things that I probably couldn't do normally. And so my sash can appear in things that maybe would have been seen as political, but as Mrs. Canada, I can be this role and also be a Métis person at the same time.
And you've also talked about wearing your Métis sash around in different locations. How does that sort of contribute to you, sharing your message?
It's amazing. So a lot of people ask, so it's a natural conversation point of like, what is that for? Or some people share their own history. It's like a gate into people's lives. And some people just ask out of curiosity. Some ask because they might have their own culture rediscovery that they're going through, whether they're Indigenous or not. And the other thing that it does is every single time I wear it, I'm just so proud because I know my grandmother could never wear her sash in public. During her time, it was illegal. And so I never take for granted the fact that I can wear this wherever I want, whenever I want, and that I'm not penalized for it. And so there's also that like pride of cyclical generational trauma, knowing that that part is broken, that I can wear my sash. And it's something I'm really proud of and not ashamed of.
That's great, and it's we talked a little bit about how much that sash means to you, and I thought that was it's really interesting. Wanted to move on and talk a little bit about National Truth and Reconciliation Day. As you know, tomorrow obviously is Canada's first National Truth and Reconciliation Day. What does that day mean to you as a Métis person, and how are you choosing to honor the significance of the day?
Wow, yeah. So the day was recommended back in 2015 as part of our 94 calls to action for truth and reconciliation. So personally, I'm proud of Canada for finally making it a day. I think that is a huge milestone. When I look back in our history and all the work it's taken to have real conversations and recognition and commemoration, this day is very significant. And as an Indigenous person, it makes me feel like there is real weight behind the things that have been said. And so apologies that have been made, promises that have been made, it really starts to put real weight and recognition in a way that's different. When you actually designate a day and you tell Canadians this is what this day is for, it's certainly different than having a call to action in a report with no action.
No, for sure. That makes sense. Why is it important, do you think, that both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people recognize and acknowledge National Truth and Reconciliation Day?
Matt, that's such an amazing question because in my mind, and you can probably tell by who I am, I believe we have a shared path forward. And that shared path forward requires all of us. So if we celebrate and commemorate separately, we'll never come together in a shared path. And when we look at the initial ideas of treaty, and one of the first ones being the Two-Row Wampum Belt, the idea was that people would be parallel together and that we would go together in a shared direction. And so the more that we continue to parse off and say, well, I celebrate this and you don't, at the end of the day, we're Canadian. And so Canada requires all of us. It requires our diversity. It requires all of us to show up as who we are. We can't be that rich nation that's not just rich in resources, but in culture, identity, people, if we don't help each other show up in who we are. And so I think this day requires all of us. And it's also that commitment that we won't ever do that to each other again, that we won't ever go back to a place where we thought that cultures were superior and that we had to actually breed culture out of people. It's that commitment too of that shared path forward that looks different than some of our dark history.
Absolutely. I think the shared path forward is a great way to put it. And I think that's a really good example and good explanation for why everybody needs to observe this day and take some time to pause and reflect on Indigenous relations and the residential schools situation that people are still living with the after effects of. Since
Yeah, and Matt, I'll just add on quickly too. Like if we think about Remembrance Day and the way we honor our veterans, this day, that's the easiest parallel I think for people is people have been lost, lives have been taken. And so this day is to actually set aside and honor the people's lives who were lost. And also the generational trauma that's occurred from children being missing and people who didn't get to grow up the way that some others did. So that's an parallel to think about is mourning those we've lost. And Murray Sinclair has been very bold about speaking about, how many children might we find? And the numbers are mounting. I think if we continue to look, it'll be more. But he said, prepare for at least 20,000. And so when we start to think about commemorating, it's pretty important that we take a day, much like Remembrance Day, where we honor our veterans, but a day to honor Canadians that are no longer here or suffering the trauma from going through such a terrible experience.
Absolutely. I think that the parallel to Remembrance Day makes a lot of sense to me as
Yeah.
sort of thinking about this as a first time having this holiday and thinking about how I should be thinking about it and, observing it. I think Remembrance Day is a good parallel. Now, as we talked about a little bit earlier today, since you and I had our pre-call, MPAC has decided to make this day of reflection and pause a paid day off for staff. What is the significance, in your view, of recognizing this as a day off with pay to take time to observe and reflect going forward?
Yeah, well, first I want to congratulate Impact for the leadership. It takes courage to be a leader. And, you can Google it and see who's observing the day, who's not, what organizations, and where the divide has occurred with federally sort of organized stuff, right? So I do applaud Impact for being a leader in a time where leadership is needed and where people are scared and don't know what to do. And it just takes those first few organizations to do things the way they should be done. So when it comes to pay, I mean, at the end of the day, we all need to make a living. And if we don't have days set aside that are protected for us to be human and to connect and to be people, we don't do it. Because we all know we have to make a living. And so if the day isn't paid, it's asking people to choose between commemorating and to go make a living. And I just think if you can take that pressure off of somebody and say, this day is important, don't worry about it. Do what you need to do, whether it's be in community, be in ceremony, whatever it is you think is appropriate for you or your family, or explore more. Like some people just need space to learn. But if you're worried that your employer will penalize you by not paying you or by, you can choose to not show up, that's a whole other conversation. So I think by organizations taking that pressure away, it gives Canadians space to actually commemorate the day and to explore and to find out, what can I do? And so you can see that pressure taken off of Canadians with other holidays where we're not worried. We don't have to work Christmas Day. We don't have to work Remembrance Day. We can do the things that our family needs us to do and show up, and also do our own exploration without worrying. And so that's where I think that pay starts to come in.
Sounds good. I totally agree.
Yeah.
So we do have one small interactive portion of this session, which is a poll. So we have a poll, and Justin or Carrie, if you don't mind putting that poll up. The question we are asking staff to respond to is, how are you planning to observe National Truth and Reconciliation Day? So there's a few options here. One, I'm going to read more about the legacy of residential schools. I'm planning on attending a local ceremony. I'm going to spend time reflecting on the meaning of the day, or I'm not sure. Now, Lorelei, I don't want you to bias the results here, but do you have any thoughts about how MPAC staff, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can or should commemorate this day?
I think there are all really good ideas that are in there. And I think just acknowledging the day is a first step. So I would just tell everybody, don't be hard on yourself. Don't think you have to achieve it all and get a bunch of check marks. But I think if there's just one small thing you can do is to get up in the morning and just think about the day itself, I think that's a huge step. These are conversations we've never had as Canadians. And for while a lot of people, especially Indigenous people, the knowledge is not new, we know that our children didn't come home. But for a lot of people, reconciling that and really understanding it is a whole other. So I would say, wake up in the morning. First of all, wake up. Second of all, be kind to yourself and be kind to the process that this requires, and then decide what feels right for the day. I mean, education is great. There's so many live streams happening. The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has a lot of interactive activities. If you have children, like coloring sheets are just even a great way for them to color something and talk about it. But I think you can't really do anything wrong on the day, except like maybe commit to spending the day with something completely unrelated and pretending the day doesn't exist. I think that, but just knowing the day is there. And I would say this is planting a seed. So think about what action you might take, but it doesn't have to be immediate. And so give yourself some time to decide what you might do with the year, what you might do in the next couple of years. And this is the beginning of that. So I would say, a journey always starts with that first step. And let tomorrow be a first step for some of you who haven't taken these steps yet.
No, absolutely. And you can see, I don't know if you can see on your screen, Lorelei, the poll results. So about 25% of people say they're going to read more about the legacy of residential schools, which I think is great. And our president, Nicole McNeil, sent out an email with some links to interesting articles and other documents to sort of educate yourself about residential schools. Something that I took Canadian history for many years and just didn't have any idea of the scope of residential schools. And now I have 2 small children. So to your point, I wake up and I'm going to think about the meaning of the day, because I can only imagine how devastated I would be if somebody took my children away, or if one or both of my children never came home, right? And so that's something I'm certainly going to think about it. And my kids' local school does a really good job of, where they have Orange Shirt Day, but they also have a lot of, they learn a lot. And my son, who is in senior kindergarten, will come home and tell me about, Indigenous relations and residential, and he knows a lot about that. So that's it's a start anyway. And
this is fantastic, because I mean, years ago, if we asked Canadians this question, I don't know how many people would say I'm going to spend time reflecting on the meaning of the day, because we didn't even have a day. And so it's amazing to see how, as a nation, we're moving forward. And I would tell people, that will lead to a hyper vigilance around where in our systems we're still creating colonial thinking. I'll give 2 quick school examples, Matt, because you were just talking about your children. But in 2018, there was a multiple choice test in Alberta, and it was given to students, and it said, can you pick the 1 positive things about residential school? Well, that's not a great multiple choice question. And really, there's not a lot of positive. And so then that went out of the curriculum. In 2020, that same question surfaced in Abbotsford, and a student in grade 6 brought it home to their mom, and they were asked to write an essay on the positive effects of residential school. It's 2020. So that vigilance and that reflection on tomorrow will hopefully help people lead change. I got a text from a friend yesterday from a Catholic school in Calgary, and the Catholic school on their own decided that this week would be in honor of Orange Shirt Day. I think there was good intentions, but they decided to make it Colors of the Week around science. And so it was like, Monday wear your yellow shirt, and this day wear this, and on Friday wear your red shirt for Terry Fox, and on Thursday wear your orange shirt. That's the point of this week, isn't to celebrate the colors of the week, and it's a commemoration week. And so those are the kinds of things, for those of you who are involved in school systems or with children or any sort of thing, having that vigilance. And I think for that school, it probably would have just taken one person to say, hey, let's not do like rainbow of the week this week, because orange shirt isn't just another color. Let's spend the week in truth and reconciliation activities. And so those are the kinds of things that I think, reflecting on tomorrow, you can, as people who live in Canada and care about the future of our country, can help in systems make better decisions around how we're talking about things and how we're commemorating.
Absolutely. And I thought it was interesting in the poll results, which popped up, about 8% of people said they were planning on attending some sort of local ceremony. Again, because we have the paid day off, people have the opportunity to do that, an opportunity to go to a local ceremony, learn, and I think that's great that people are taking the opportunity to do that.
Yeah. Congratulations to all of you out there. I've never been more proud to be Canadian, and to just know that we have a whole group of people just on this call alone who are committed to this shared path forward.
So I know there's so much interesting sort of stuff about your history and about your previous work and your current work. So I'm going to have to move on and ask a couple of more questions. I have so many, and it's just it's interesting to talk to you, and it's been a fun conversation. So you currently work at the City of Calgary. You've been at the City of Calgary for several years now. I won't say how many, but I did look it up on LinkedIn. You were previously an Indigenous relations strategist, but you're now the community lead for the anti-racism program team. I hope I have that all correct. Can you tell us a bit about your role, both as an Indigenous relations strategist, and then why you switched into an anti-racism role?
Yeah, for sure. So my grandmother also told me to never work for government. So here I am making change in the system. So I just want to say,
government employees too. So.
Yeah, exactly. So I am one of those people that I'm not going to complain about a system. I'm going to dive in and make change where I can. So I purposely stayed with government because it's a hard place to be as an Indigenous person. But it's been an amazing experience so far in my career. So yes, I've been in many roles with the City of Calgary. After a long stout of international development work, I was exhausted, and I decided I should work for local government so I could grow my roots a little more. And I have two beautiful children now and an MBA as a result, by being more rooted and not in so many countries around the globe right now. But local government has been amazing because change happens so quickly, so you can enact change fairly fast. But I have held several portfolios, including business portfolios, budget portfolios. But at one point, I was on a leadership program in 2017 with the Governor General, and he said to me in a room of 600 people in a small fireside chat, he said, "Lorelei, what are you doing for reconciliation?" And I was like, "I'm Indigenous, like I'm going to be me." And you could tell his honor was like, "That's a good answer, but like, what are you doing?" And so that was my next call to action. So I look at life as like, where are those pivot points, and where do you deepen, and where do you like go further than you thought you could go? And it was very funny timing, because after returning from this leadership program, I came back to work and I was working in my business portfolio, and an opportunity came to create a business case for an Indigenous relations office. And it's always hard to bring your whole person and your culture and your identity to a role, especially a very public role like working for government. And so I was like, after leaving the federal government and being all about Indigenous matters, I was like, do I feel ready to bring all of that to a local government context? And I thought, oh, well, his worship had asked me to, so I should probably. And so when the call came, I was ready. And so I said, yeah, I'll join this team. We had in 2016, it's called the White Goose Flying, but we responded to the 94 calls to action as a municipality, and we committed to 43. However, no resources were ever put to it. And so I felt really compelled, this was 2017, let's do this. And so I ended up taking the business case forward by 2019, and our Indigenous Relations Office was formed. I think it was a $1.2 million budget with 7 positions, which was unheard of in a time of economic contraction. And so that office then did face a few budget cuts as we've had all these things happen, but they are fully up and running now. And I felt good at that point. You know, I reached a point where I was helping change the conversation to be more inclusive and to include urban Indigenous Calgarians in matters, and also the Métis Nation and some of the other groups that had historically maybe not been considered or just to the side of municipal matters. And so, yeah, so I did that. And now I've moved on to our anti-racism portfolio. And Matt, do you want me to share why?
Yeah, why did you move to the anti-racism world?
So Indigenous matters and Indigenous relations comes quite naturally to me, but I'm also a very multicultural person. I've always worked in global contexts, and I've always worked with people to do their own cultural rediscovery, because you don't have to be Indigenous to have a culture. And so some of my favorite projects have been those that are people like, well, I don't have a culture, I'm not Indigenous. I'm like, okay, where do you come from? What recipe did your grandmother use? What language? And so it's always amazing to walk with people to realize we all come from somewhere. And so I always long to be in cross-cultural environments and in spaces where we are all coming with something to the cultural table. And so as Calgary was moving into anti-racism work with the murder of George Floyd, Calgarians came out in a big way. They signed a petition. Over 72,000 people came forward with a petition calling on City Council to hold public hearings on racism. And so this was the first call to action following the murder of George Floyd. And there was another dialogue happening too, where Indigenous people were actually saying, you know, what have we ever done when Indigenous people are murdered and missing, especially women? And there was a couple Canadian companies that provided a response to the murder of George Floyd. And a few Indigenous people took exception because they said, you've never issued a statement when an Indigenous person has died, ever. And so it became this like friction point in Calgary where people really wanted to talk about racism, but there was like this idea of like, have we properly addressed racism in other forms as well? And so I saw this friction point. I was helped with part of getting elders in for the public hearings. And I kind of watched the dialogue unfold, and it interested me because I thought, wow, this is a lot of work to do. But I also saw our Indigenous Relations Office kind of over here and our anti-racism work emerging here with a separate group of people. And as the true mediator and bridge builder, I decided to leap over and create a connection between our Indigenous Relations Office and our anti-racism team, because there's nothing like being embedded to actually create a connection. And part of what I've been working on is just really grounding our anti-racism work locally in our colonial history. Because what I noticed is in all our anti-racism statements and the work that we were doing, not once did we acknowledge that our racist roots actually begin with our colonial history. And if we peel that back all the way to edicts from the Pope and the idea of terra nullius 500 years ago, the racism roots began. And so people came across to Canada looking for empty lands that could be considered so if people were uncivilized. And so that's where I started getting interested of like, well, what story are we telling? What narrative is being taught to the future generations? And where do we create those bridges between what our actual history is and where we're moving forward as a society, and all the conversations in between, how our racism actually has perpetuated into many other populations. And so you can see I was quite passionate about it. And so when the positions were posted, I did not hesitate for a second to jump into the very complicated pool of anti-racism work in the community.
No, I think it's so interesting about your bridge building and your work sort of with Indigenous relations, and then moving over to anti-racism and all the background, and how that's your background and your history sort of shaped the roles you do and how you created a new department and then how you switch departments. It's all, I find it fascinating myself. I have another question. We had an interesting discussion previously about the intersection of equity, diversity, and inclusion with anti-racism. That's something that MPAC is working on a little bit now. Can you tell us more about that intersection, equity, diversity, inclusion with anti-racism in your new role?
Yeah, and that's such a great question. And there's a lot of confusion. So if any of you out there are feeling like we're doing diverse, equity, inclusion, but now anti-racism, where does it all fit? It all fits together. So don't worry. You can't possibly do anything wrong. But if you look at it as a whole picture, there's many parts to the shared path forward that's required. So for me, diversity, equity, inclusion is aspirational. It's what we want to be. Who doesn't want to be diverse? Who doesn't want to be inclusive? Who doesn't want those things, right? Like that is the hope we hold. And that is what we're working towards. However, there's this stark reality of like, what systems do we need to change? Where do we need to agitate things and be disruptors? And diversity, equity, inclusion work does call us to do that, but it keeps us in like the hope and the. So I always say anti-racism work is a little bit gritty. It's what's required to actually talk about what is. And anti-racism work truly requires action. So it calls us to action. Like, what are you actually doing to actually create change? And if I was to put them in like a family tree, I would say anti-racism work is like the not as pretty work, because it's like you have to have really hard conversations and speak truth and call out systems and say some things that aren't pleasant, right? Like we don't want to talk about some of these things. And so anti-racism work puts us firmly there. And diverse, equity, inclusion work is kind of the nicer, maybe like the prettier part at times. And it's not always, like, I'm not saying all the details are pretty, but the words alone are like, right? So you get, if you work in both sides, you get to be part of it all and realize that it's all required, but there are distinctions between the work. And so a lot of people do ask, and I know it's quite popular right now to create equity offices and then fold everything inside of it. I would just caution a bit, because it can become like a blanket statement. Kind of like the week I was talking about, where the colors of the week shirt were like, today's orange shirt, but tomorrow's green shirt. Just be careful with the work, because it requires considerations that are unique to each portion of it, but you require weavers in between. And so the worst mistakes I see people do is to create distinct offices that aren't connected, because then it's like, oh, but that's Indigenous relations, they're over there. And then that's diversity, equity, inclusion, that's over there. But at what point do we see ourselves as whole people that's all required? And so I would say keep the work distinct and know what piece you're working on, but look for the weavers, the people who bring it together, and the people who help it make sense, and the people who help us understand that it is all required, but it's just different requirements for each part.
I think that's just a really good explanation of the differences between anti-racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, but also how they work together. That's something that, I mean, to be honest, that wasn't clear to me when you raised this as an issue in our pre-call. And I think it's really clear and really sort of well articulated, sort of explain the differences, but also the connections. So I have, as you know, I have like dozens more questions, but I'm going to sort of ask sort of one more final one, although it is a big one. One of the things that was really interesting that we talked about in our prior call was that you work in anti-racism, but we've never actually lived in an anti-racist society. So lots of people work in anti-racism, talk about anti-racism objectives, but it's sort of hard to tell what you're striving towards, because we've never actually had the anti-racism society. So my question to you is, easy question in the last couple of minutes. What does an anti-racist society actually look like to you? And is that a possible objective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. And, it was one of my colleagues that at one point was like, we all don't know what we're building. And then he said, who's lived in an anti-racist society? And I'm sure people have had experiences where there's been true equality and where you can fully show up as you. But as a whole, I don't know what parts of the globe can actually say they've lived in an anti-racist society, maybe a long, long time ago. But I would say this gives us that space of possibility. And for a lot of people, that's uncomfortable, because you want to know. It's like, okay, in 10 years, what will we be able to measure? And Western ways of knowing always want us to be able to measure and quantify. And some things are not always that way. And so I'd say this space requires all of it. And that idea, so Indigenous ways of knowing is often like, you can feel it in your body. There's other indicators, whether it's in the environment or signs that you've received or something you got in ceremony, but there's a way of knowing. And so I would say this work requires us to really tap into our ways of knowing. And it also speaks to our human potential. And so as a good political scientist, I do actually analyze things too, from a lens of like, what political philosophers saw the best in society and what systems have helped us achieve that. So I think things that move us closer to that shared future and where we all have a piece and we can show up as who we are. You know, Brian talked about his own journey through that identity. So in a anti-racist society, I would say we all get to just show up as who we are. There's room for our languages to be spoken and celebrated. We can work within and between cultures. We can take the best of each other and share it. We can speak many languages, and a lot of them, the ones that are disappearing, are not disappeared, but they're here. And I think that we can all realize we have an integral role to play. I was recently in French Polynesia, and I was reminded of the movie Moana because they like literally said the same things as the movie in some parts, but I was working in some cultural capacities, and the person literally said, you know, here on the island, we're all required. There is no one person that can't be here because we can't do it alone. So if we start to switch our entire way of thinking, and Western ways of thinking has really pushed us into individualism. But if we start to move back to what is it to achieve success as a whole, and we start to even look at our environment as a part of our whole, we can't survive if our environment is not surviving. And we start to realize that interconnectedness, I think that is what moves us closer. So for those of you that are looking for like, how do we get there? Start looking at collectivist ways of thinking, how we look at future generations and past generations. There's a wonderful Thanksgiving prayer from the Mohawk Nation, and it's such a lovely way to bring yourself into the space, but they talk about being of one mind. And so before any meetings, anything happens, this prayer is read, and it actually talks about we can't move forward together if our minds aren't together and then our spirits aren't together. And so if we start to think about every action you take, previous generations and future generations, and thinking holistically, I think that starts to move us closer to an anti-racist society because we're not thinking about ourselves.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. I think that's a sort of a great final thought to leave people on. Perfect. That was a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Again, I have many more questions that I'm going to have to ask you offline.
Matt, I have many questions myself. The problem is I don't have a lot of answers, and I often leave with more questions. So I'm always happy to chat with people.
Well, we appreciate it. This is great. So thank you so much for joining us for this this really powerful discussion in advance of such an important day that we discussed tomorrow. So thank you so much.
Oh, Marcy, thank you so much. And thank you for the work your organization is doing. And for all of you listening in, thank you for having the courage to show up today, to listen to this conversation, and to just think differently if you haven't thought this way before, but also wherever you are on the journey of truth and reconciliation, the courage you have to imagine a different future, one without residential schools. So I just congratulate all of you and your leadership, Matt, and the leadership that's with you along the way.
Great. Thanks so much, Lorelei.
Thank you.
To provide a few updates to folks listening in. So again, thanks to Lorelei for joining us. I thought that was terrific. Next Wednesday, October 6th, the EMG and the hybrid work team will be joining us for an Ask Us Anything return to office / return to field update. As we prepare for October 18th, when all MPAC employees will be expected to work in the office at least one day a week. We know that many of you have questions on what to expect, and we look forward to providing you with answers next week. As well, on Wednesday, October 13th, please join us for a health and wellness webinar with Homewood Health, appropriately named Managing the Transition Back to the Workplace. The webinar will be hosted by Michael Bowman, because apparently legal is taking over virtual leaderships, and will be facilitated by Ryan Vance Cruis from Homewood Health. So keep an eye out for an invitation to these VLCs coming into your inbox. As always, please email your questions to communications@mpac.ca, and I will see you next week. Thanks very much.